How's it going, everybody? It's Dr. Jeff from Rythmia Life Advancement Center, Chief Medical Officer here at Rythmia. And today's topic, we're going to discuss a little bit about addiction. And addiction is just a super important issue because nowadays so many people are affected by addiction, either themselves or in their family. It's taking a toll on communities. There's a lot of funding that gets wasted and not used appropriately, and it's just like a total nightmare. So I want to give you guys a little bit of info about addiction and some ways that I've seen over the years that it can be treated in a really productive way. So just first of all, a little background on me just briefly about addiction. I used to run a rehab in Malibu for about 8 years. I was the administrative director, so I worked with thousands of clients there. I also did, when I was in my doctoral program, I did internships at 3 addiction facilities. One of them was a sex addiction facility. Another one was an inpatient 12-step facility for drug and alcohol addiction. And then the third was a psychiatric hospital where I worked in the locked units and ran groups and had individual clients, and most of them had dual diagnosis with an addiction component. Also in my practice working there in Los Angeles, I had the bulk of my clients were addicts. And I've seen a lot of stuff, over the years. And when I was in Hawaii working with the Department of Health, a lot of addiction in Hawaii, a lot of addiction in the families, and it's a real problem. So, addiction isn't really understood by society at large. People just say, well, you have a disease, there's nothing we can do. The only thing you can do is go to some sort of hardcore facility that's going to scare you into being sober. And the numbers on that, the statistics on those kind of places are really low, and those are expensive places. So what I've noticed over the years is there's really 2 components to addiction. One of those is there's a biological component that I'm going to explain a little bit. And of course, there's a behavioral component, or what I like to call an underlying sort of issue or issues that people have that lead to addiction. People often say, oh, I inherited alcoholism from my family, which is not true exactly, because there isn't an alcohol gene. So you can't inherit alcoholism from a family line. But what you can inherit is a certain neurochemical profile. You can inherit low dopamine, for example. And if your family and your great-grandfather and your grandfather and your dad and all your uncles and your mom and your sisters and your cousins and everybody, if you see them dealing with a low dopamine issue, which usually represents some depression, if you see them drinking alcohol to kind of remedy or self-medicate their depression, then you are observing a behavioral strategy and a coping mechanism to deal with the depression. And so then it can kind of play out in a family because it's the culture of the family. We all drink to feel better. We all drink because that's just what we do when we're sad. Or to balance out my dopamine, I drink, and I feel better. And people obviously don't know necessarily they have a low dopamine, but they just know that when they drink alcohol, as an example, they feel better and they feel more content, and the blues go away, and they feel a little bit more social, and that's what leads to an addiction. And that's a biological component. Now, there's other people that didn't inherit, as an example, a low level of dopamine. Their dopamine's normal, but because they have underlying issues that are emotional, behavioral, often trauma-related, and they're drinking alcohol to kind of avoid those feelings because it's hard, and there's a lot of issues that are rough to deal with, and they might not have the tools. They drink and they kind of forget about them. And so what happens is, with an addiction, is that the neurochemistry, and because your body is always trying to get a level of homeostasis, which is balance internally. So if your body normally produces dopamine without alcohol, but then all of a sudden it's getting this external source that causes dopamine to surge, the body balances itself and starts to produce less dopamine normally on its own. And then what happens is you drink and it surges it. And then you try to stop, and it's really hard because you feel super depressed and you feel chemically dependent, as they call it. So that's sort of the biological side of addiction. Now, when people refer to, in the field of addiction, they often call it a disease. And this is a controversial term because, is it a disease? Well, is it like cancer? Is it like, is it like HIV? Is it a disease, right? So A lot of people think that it is. Most people in addiction do. A lot of people think that it's not. And the way I like to explain it is, you don't have a disease when you start to drink or use drugs. But then as you continue down that path, your neurochemistry adjusts, your body shifts, you're damaging your liver, you're messing up your hormones, you're messing up your neurochemicals. And so there is a shift that occurs neurochemically that's been proven in science that occurs. And then you can look at that in a sense that that's a disease. But that disease was totally self-created because it wasn't there to begin with, right? So that's where it gets a little confusing. And oftentimes when people say that, oh, I just have a disease, with some people, it tends to give them an out and just be like, well, there's nothing I can do about it. I have a disease. It's kind of like an excuse. Now, for some people, that helps them to kind of frame it like that. So I'm not trying to say everything's black and white, but there's definitely things to think about when calling addiction a disease. And it does change neurochemistry, and it does cause behavioral and physical symptoms of withdrawal when they stop. So there's a lot of chemistry going on and a lot of biology going on with addiction. So the other part of addiction, which is the behavioral side, that's based on, like, for example, if somebody has a history of trauma and those emotions are surfacing in their daily life, and they don't have the tools to deal with them, or they don't have the time, they're super busy, and they just don't have, they maybe got a bunch of family to take care of, and they got a hard job, then they'll drink or use drugs to kind of like escape. And what are they escaping from, right? Well, oftentimes it's trauma history. Oftentimes it's like relationship issues. There could be some abusive environments that they live in. They could be being victimized in a power struggle with their partner. There's a million reasons. They might have some bad influences in their life, their situation. They might not have good self-esteem. There's a lot of reasons why people drink or use drugs to avoid things. So the problem in treating addiction is that if you go, let's say, to a rehab, most of that time spent there is just detoxing with meds to try to get off the drugs and alcohol in a safe way. And then, in theory, there's some groups and some therapy and some other things, depending on the facility, that will hopefully address like what's going on underneath it all. So that, unfortunately, can take a really long time, and it's hard to get that handled just in a couple of weeks at a rehab or a month, and it's very expensive. So what I love about plant medicine as a remedy for addiction is it helps the person get a biological or a neurochemical foothold on their addiction, and it helps them address the history of trauma or the history of events that they're struggling with, and it gives them some clarity. So what goes on neurochemically with plant medicine is it's fine-tuning your synapses in your brain, and it's adjusting certain neurochemical balances. It's resetting dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine and other neurochemicals to make it so you don't have necessarily like a hardcore withdrawal. It's also making it so you don't have those physical cravings. You don't have that biological need for the substance. So that part's amazing with plant medicine. And it can happen quickly in a couple nights, which is incredible. And the other part, which is the behavioral part, the emotional part, that gets resolved when you do the plant medicine, when you have those intentions and you're focused on it and you're open to the process. Those two things together are huge. They're huge. So what happens is when people address their addiction with plant medicine and they do it in a safe way, and as you know, we're licensed medically here in Costa Rica to do this, what happens is they don't have the cravings any longer, physically or biologically. But then if they don't address the emotional side and the history of trauma, they can fall back into a pattern of using. So the beauty of what we're doing at Rythmia is that we address those traumatic histories and we look at those issues. We help you set those intentions and get everything clear so you can resolve the biological side and get clarity on the emotional side or the traumatic side. And then when you leave, obviously you go home to environments where you were triggered. There's the same neighborhood, there's the same partners that you have, there's the same friends, same job. And the circumstances around you have not necessarily changed one bit. So they can be triggering. So that's why it's important to stay focused on you and do some aftercare and some follow-up work and get involved in sober environments and sober groups and be able to reinforce your sobriety. And the reason why it's much more successful with a plant medicine approach is because you don't have that craving that was super strong because that was based on neurochemical imbalances that you were likely dealing with. So you have that part kicked out of the way, and now you can just focus on, okay, well, maybe I do need to change some of my social environments, and maybe I do need to get, change a few of these friends potentially. And maybe I do need to get a new job, if that was super stressful and just not good for you. So you have the clarity of mind to do that kind of work. So addiction is, it's a tough one. And it's also a huge industry. The meds associated with detoxing people, and especially with opiates and with the opiate crisis, there's tons of meds that they give you to block the opiate receptors so you don't have the physical cravings. And Suboxone is the one they're using mostly now. Historically, it was methadone, and people get hooked on that. So it's a multi-billion-dollar industry of making money. So that part's also hard. So you're dealing with the physicians that were trained to give you a certain medical protocol of meds to detox, and then to try to balance your mood, they'll give you antidepressants, and they'll give you some other things, sometimes anti-anxiety meds. And if you have an opiate addiction, they'll give you Suboxone, and for other people back in the day it was methadone. And that's kind of like you stay on those things for a long time is the protocol. So that right there, we all know that that's not an answer to this, and you're still on meds, and it's rough. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't like to make a blanket statement. Some people absolutely need those meds, and they do, and it's okay. But the bulk of the people that have been treated for addiction in the Western framework are over-medicated, and they're put on those meds for way too long, and they're not given the tools on how to change. And it is hard because getting those tools often are expensive. It's hard to go to therapy. It's expensive. It's hard to go do yoga every day. It's expensive. There's all these things that you're supposed to be doing, but you're busy. You're working. There's a lot going on. You have to watch your kids. It's hard. So the beauty of and the absolute miracle that's going on here at Rythmia every single week for people, and we have we always have a couple people that have an addiction history. We're not technically a rehab, but we do have people with addiction history. We have we're overall wellness here, but absolutely we all know that addiction creeps into lots of our lives, right? It's a big part of our families and our communities. So what goes on here in a week is mind-blowing, because like I said earlier in this webinar, is that you get a neurochemical foothold, and that gets knocked out, and then you get an emotional clarity, and you get trauma resolved. So then you can move forward, and you're not triggered. You're not feeling the stress to keep going and use it, because you don't need to avoid yourself anymore. You don't need to avoid those feelings because you've resolved them here. There's a ton of integration, and I'm available for talking to you, doing some counseling. There's a lot of holistic people here, life coaches, and a lot of people that are here to support you in this process. What's interesting with the behavioral addictions as opposed to the chemical addictions, and when I say chemical addictions, I'm talking about drugs and alcohol. And the behavioral addictions are also very prominent, and those are hard because those are things that we do normally in our lives to live and as part of life. Eating disorders, eating addictions, sex addiction, shopping addiction. There's all these behavioral things. There's gambling addiction. Now, these are things that are in the world that are not chemical-based substances that we're ingesting. And so there's a whole different protocol to address those sort of issues. It involves a lot of behavior modification, cognitive behavioral therapy, and a lot of other things. What's interesting, I want to tell you guys a little bit about gambling addiction, which is a lot of people don't know this. There's a couple of great doctors, psychiatrists at UCLA that I learned from that are gambling addiction experts. And I learned a lot from being at UCLA and reading a lot of their papers and stuff and working with people that have gambling addiction. So for all you guys in Vegas, what's up? Not that you all have addictions to gambling, but you see it all around you, right? And what's going on with gambling addiction is, and we can liken this to a lot of other addictions that are behavioral based. When you go to a casino, there's a lot of fanfare in there, right? There's a lot of lights, there's a lot of sounds, there's a lot of, like, the roulette wheel is spinning, the slot machines are turning, what card is coming next from the dealer, right? There's all this activity. And in reality, right, gambling, if it's an odds game and there's ratios, all you'd have to do technically is push a button and see the result, right? Put your money in, push a button and see the result. But that's not the addicting part. The addicting part is the uncertainty of what's coming. So the minute you pull that slot machine handle and the numbers are spinning, you're thinking, okay, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And that is a serotonin surge in the brain. And that is what is the numbing or addicting or the high that comes from gambling. It's not the results. It's not the winnings of the slot machine. It's the what's going to happen next. And that's why roulette wheels spin and they spin and they spin. Like, man, this thing's spinning forever. That's why in craps, you roll the dice and you put down the chips, and it's like there's a waiting period between when you gambled and then when you see the result. And that's where the high is located. So but you always, people that aren't gambling addicts, like they say, well, this dude just won, $10,000. Why does he keep putting it back in the slot machine? It's because the high is not in the winning. The high is in the process. And that's how it is for sex addiction. And sex addiction is often related to pornography. And pornography addiction is not necessarily based on the images being viewed. It's about what is the next image and the next image and the next image that I can find and what's going on for the next. And that's the rush. That's the serotonin surge. So that's a part neurochemically in the brain that gets stimulated, right? Is that expectation, that excitement. And that's the part that's addicting. So a little note on behavioral addictions. There's ways to treat that too. At Rythmia, we have a protocol to treat behavioral issues. It's the same thing. We reset neurochemistry with the plant medicine, and we work on the emotional, behavioral side and the traumatic history you potentially have that you're kind of hiding from or masking because it's rough out there. The world's a rough place, and you need to reset yourself. You need to get balanced. So that's my little talk and 2 cents on addiction. I've seen a lot of madness out there. And with this opiate crisis going on in the world, I mean, it's just incredible. It's really upsetting, And opiates wear out their effectiveness so quickly. And then it's just about not being sick and not going through withdrawal. It's not even about getting high for these people on the opiates. It's really sad. But we can work with you, and we can help you with that. There's lots of plant medicines in the world that exist to treat addiction. And we're dealing with that here every week. So I hope you guys enjoyed this Facebook Live. Here's our phone number right here. If you guys want to call us, call that number, set up an appointment. We have some awesome guests this week. Lots of cool people. We're sold out this week. We're sold out next week. There's a lot of guests here, and everybody's doing great. It's really fun, to be here. It's a lot of hard work for the guests, but it's also really fun and rewarding, and it's freeing. You feel free when you're here going through this process. And we follow up with you when you get home, for those that need it. We are really concerned about your success. We want you to be happy and successful. That's why we're here. All right. Thanks for watching. Talk to you guys soon. See you next week. Pura vida.